Have you ever felt like you were born without skin, like the world is a constant storm of feelings, and while others seem to move through life shielded, you walk around with every nerve exposed? You can sense the tension in a room before anyone speaks. You pick up on the heaviness in someone's eyes before they even admit they're struggling. You're the one who notices the cracks in people's voices when they say, "I'm fine." And deep down you know they're lying, because you feel their pain as if it were your own. It's exhausting, isn't it? The way you carry invisible weights that no one else seems to notice. The way you go home from a simple dinner or meeting, feeling like you've lived through someone else's heartbreak, anger, or despair. People praise you for being kind, thoughtful, or empathetic. But what they don't realize is that every compliment is built on a cost you pay with your energy, your peace, and sometimes even your identity. Because when you're wired to feel this deeply, it's not just compassion, it's survival. Your nervous system doesn't give you a choice. Society has a word for you: sensitive, too sensitive. And maybe you've even internalized that judgment. Maybe you've looked in the mirror and wondered, what's wrong with me? Why can't I just let things roll off my back like everyone else? Why do I feel everything so intensely? You might have even started to believe the labels people threw at you: weak, fragile, broken. But what if all of those labels are completely wrong? What if what you've been taught to see as a curse is actually the seed of something extraordinary? Let's flip the perspective for a moment. Imagine that the very qualities that overwhelm you, the deep empathy, the emotional radar that never switches off, the way you absorb what others try to hide, aren't weaknesses at all. Imagine they're raw materials, unrefined power, waiting to be forged into something unstoppable. What if the emotional storm you've been drowning in your entire life isn't meant to break you, but to awaken you? This isn't just wishful thinking. It's not pop psychology or self-help fluff. Over a century ago, Carl Jung, one of the most influential minds in psychology, documented a transformation so profound, he considered it one of the most mysterious and disturbing shifts in human personality. He saw people like you, people who were unbearably sensitive, overwhelmed by the shadows of others, crushed under the weight of emotions that weren't even theirs. And he saw what happened when they finally broke down. He saw what emerged from the collapse. And what he described wasn't a victim. It wasn't fragility. It was a warrior. You see, there's a hidden pattern in the lives of the deeply sensitive. At first, they suffer. They bend under the pressure. They get sick, anxious, drained. They feel like their very existence is a curse. But then something changes. When they're pushed to their breaking point, when they can no longer carry the unbearable load, something snaps inside them. And out of that breaking point comes a kind of strength most people can't even comprehend. A strength forged not in comfort, but in fire. Jung called it individuation, but you might recognize it as the moment you finally stop being a sponge for everyone else's pain and start becoming the architect of your own boundaries. Think about it. What if the reason you've always felt broken is because you've been living without armor? What if the collapse you fear isn't an ending, but the beginning of a transformation? What if the pain that haunts you is actually the training ground for a power that can't be faked, can't be bought, can't be imitated by those who live comfortably numb? The truth is, most people never face themselves. They never confront the shadows lurking in their psyche. They distract. They numb. They project. But you, because of your sensitivity, you can't escape it. You feel too much to look away. And that's why your story is different. Your suffering isn't meaningless. It's an initiation. And the deeper you've gone into the darkness, the more powerful your awakening can be. Today we're going to dive into this hidden transformation. We're going to unravel the psychology behind your overwhelm, expose the real reason why you've carried so much pain, and reveal how those burdens can be transmuted into something extraordinary. Because your greatest vulnerability, your raw, untamed sensitivity, isn't your downfall, it's your calling card. The world doesn't need you to be less sensitive. It needs you to wake up to the power that sensitivity hides. This is the story of what happens the day you snap, the day you stop carrying what was never yours, the day you learn to fight back, not with coldness or cruelty, but with a strength that feels like finally coming home to yourself. The story of how the gentlest souls become the most unbreakable, and the only question left is, will you let the world keep telling you you're broken, or will you discover what you really are? Because once you see it, you'll never see yourself the same way again. You already know what it feels like to live in a world where the volume is turned up too high. It's not just sound, it's emotional static, blasting into your nervous system from every direction. Most people walk into a crowded space and focus on the music, the laughter, the chatter. You walk in and feel the sadness of the woman at the bar pretending she's fine. You sense the frustration radiating from the couple arguing quietly in the corner. You notice the tension hidden behind a coworker's polite smile. While everyone else is having conversations, you're absorbing atmospheres, and by the time you leave, you're drained in ways you can't explain. This is the daily curse of sensitivity. On the surface, it looks like compassion. To outsiders, it looks like kindness. They see someone who notices the small things, someone who's always there to listen, someone who instinctively knows when others are hurting. But what they don't see is the cost. They don't see the nights you lie awake replaying someone else's problems in your head. They don't see the way you walk into your own home feeling like you've been carrying emotional cargo that doesn't even belong to you. They don't see that while they walk away lighter after talking to you. You walk away heavier. And it's not just emotional, it's physical. Your body keeps the score. You feel it in your chest, your gut, your shoulders. The tension builds until you can't breathe deeply anymore. Anxiety becomes your default setting because you've been living in everyone else's storms. You find yourself apologizing for being too much, for crying too easily, for needing space, for not being able to shrug things off the way others do. But here's the brutal truth. It's not that you're weak, it's that your nervous system is wired differently. Science has a term for it: hyper-responsive mirror neurons. Your brain is literally designed to reflect and absorb what others are feeling. Where most people sense a hint of emotion, your system lights up as if you're living through it yourself. When your friend is grieving, you don't just sympathize, you carry a piece of their grief in your own chest. When your partner is angry, you don't just notice the mood, you feel the heat of it burning in your bloodstream. It's like you're running on a psychological Wi-Fi connection that never disconnects, no matter how much you want it to. Carl Jung, over a century ago, saw this pattern long before neuroscience could explain it. He called it innate sensitiveness. He noticed that a small fraction of people, maybe 1 in 4, maybe fewer, were simply wired to feel more deeply, react more intensely, and carry more emotional weight than the rest of humanity. And while society might dismiss it as fragility, Jung knew it was something else. He knew that what looks like a flaw is often the starting point of transformation. But before the transformation, there's the suffering. Because right now, your sensitivity doesn't feel like a gift. It feels like a trap. You've become the person who knows when something's wrong, but can't switch it off. You're the emotional first responder in your family, your friendships, your workplace. People may not even realize they're doing it, but they come to you like moths to a flame, because they know you'll feel with them in ways others won't. And while that makes you invaluable to them, it leaves you wrecked inside. You're constantly absorbing the emotional trash that others don't want to carry. Their anger becomes your anxiety. Their shame becomes your guilt. Their sadness becomes your depression. You've become a container for everyone else's shadows, and the weight is unbearable. Think about how many times you've walked away from an interaction questioning your own emotions, only to realize later that half of what you felt wasn't even yours. That heavy sadness after seeing a friend, that creeping self-doubt after leaving your boss's office, that wave of rage that came out of nowhere after talking to someone close to you, chances are, those weren't yours. They were projections. Emotional debris dumped onto you because you didn't have the shield to block it. This is why your life feels like a constant battle between who you are and who the world tells you to be. You've been told to toughen up, to stop taking things so personally, to grow thicker skin. But how do you grow skin when your very essence is to feel without barriers? You can't, and you shouldn't. Because what if this curse isn't meant to be cured? What if the pain you feel is the first stage of a transformation that most people will never experience? What if the very sensitivity that makes you feel broken is the exact trait that, once harnessed, will make you unbreakable? That's the secret. No one tells you about being sensitive. It's not weakness, it's power without direction. It's raw electricity with no insulation. And like electricity, it can burn you or it can light the world. The difference lies in learning how to channel it, how to turn what looks like fragility into something that no one can take from you. Jung saw it again and again. The collapse of the sensitive wasn't an end, it was the beginning of something extraordinary. And the very fact that you feel so much is proof that you're capable of depths most people will never even touch. But before you can transform, you have to understand what's really happening beneath the surface of your overwhelm. You're not just feeling emotions, you're carrying shadows. And that's where Jung's most disturbing discovery comes in. Because if you think you're just absorbing random feelings, you're wrong. What you're really absorbing is the darkness people refuse to face in themselves. And that revelation changes everything. Carl Jung didn't just study the human mind. He lived in its depths. He saw things in people that they couldn't see in themselves. And one of his most startling discoveries was what he called innate sensitiveness. To Jung, this wasn't a quirk or a weakness. It was an entire category of human existence, a way of being in the world that left a select few carrying more emotional weight than the rest of humanity combined. In 1912, Jung began describing this phenomenon in his private notes and case studies. He noticed that some individuals weren't simply empathetic in the casual sense. They weren't just good listeners or compassionate friends. They were wired differently at the deepest level of their psyche. They felt more, absorbed more, and broke down faster under the intensity of other people's emotions. Jung estimated that perhaps a quarter of humanity carried this wiring, though modern research suggests the number may be closer to 1 or 2% who experience it at its extreme. That tiny percentage, the ultra-sensitive, are living examples of what happens when a nervous system is tuned like a radio that can't stop picking up frequencies. Jung recognized that these people weren't imagining things. They weren't fragile, hysterical, or making it up as society often claimed. They were experiencing the world through what we now understand as hyper-responsive mirror neurons. In other words, their brains didn't just recognize emotions, they mirrored them, copied them, and replayed them as if they were happening inside their own bodies. That's why the pain of others doesn't just sadden you, it lives inside you. That's why tension in a room doesn't just make you uncomfortable. It feels like your own skin is on fire. You're not weak. You're biologically wired to reflect what others suppress. But Jung took it one step further. He saw that this sensitivity wasn't just about emotional overload. It was about shadows. You see, most people live with hidden parts of themselves. They refuse to acknowledge anger, shame, guilt, fear, inadequacy. They bury these emotions deep in the unconscious, locking them away like unwanted secrets. But here's the catch. What's repressed doesn't disappear. It leaks, it projects outward, and the ones most vulnerable to picking it up are people like you. Jung called this dynamic shadow projection. Imagine a theater where everyone's darkest parts are playing on the screen, but nobody admits they're the ones holding the projector. Instead, they act like it's all someone else's problem. And you, because of your innate sensitiveness, are the ones sitting in the front row watching the movie as if it's your own life. You don't just witness their projections, you absorb them. Their anger shows up as your anxiety. Their shame echoes inside as your guilt. Their insecurity plants itself as your self-doubt. Suddenly, you're living with emotions that don't even belong to you, and you don't realize you've become a carrier of other people's shadows. This was Jung's revelation. The sensitive are not just compassionate souls, they are shadow carriers. They unconsciously take on the psychological refuse of those around them, and that role is brutal. It's why so many sensitive people collapse under the weight of invisible struggles. You're not just carrying your own wounds, you're carrying everyone else's too. To Jung, this explained why some of the most deeply sensitive individuals broke down so dramatically. Their lives looked like endless cycles of burnout, breakdown, and despair. But in Jung's eyes, these weren't meaningless collapses, they were turning points. He saw this in patient after patient. People whose lives were consumed by the projections of others would eventually reach a breaking point. They would collapse under the unbearable tension. But instead of labeling it as failure, Jung reframed it as a form of initiation. He believed the psyche itself was forcing a transformation, a controlled demolition of an identity that could no longer carry the weight of unconscious shadows. The breakdown wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of individuation, the process of becoming whole. Think about how radical that was. At a time when society called sensitivity weakness, Jung suggested it was destiny. He saw in sensitive souls a pattern of alchemy. First comes the suffering, carrying shadows, feeling broken. Then comes the collapse, what feels like the end of everything. And then, if you endure it, comes the awakening, the realization that you're not just a sponge for other people's darkness, you are someone capable of turning that darkness into fuel. This is the hidden truth that most people miss. Your breakdown is not proof of fragility, it's proof of potential. The fact that you've been crushed by emotional overload means you've been entrusted with a depth of experience most people will never know. You've lived in the shadows. You've carried what others denied, and because of that, you have access to strength others will never touch. Jung believed this journey was the blueprint for transformation, and if you're walking this path, it means your suffering has meaning. It's not random, it's the beginning of your becoming. But to understand what really happens during this transformation, we have to dive deeper into the mechanics of projection itself. Because you're not just absorbing random emotions, you've been targeted in ways you don't even realize. People aren't just sharing their pain with you, they're unloading their shadows onto you. And unless you recognize this dynamic, you'll keep mistaking their baggage for your own. That's where the trap lies, and that's what we're going to unravel next. Here's the part most people never realize. You're not just sensitive. You've become the emotional landfill for everyone around you. Their unprocessed anger, their shame, their insecurities. They don't deal with them, they dump them. And you, without even knowing it, have been carrying their trash inside your own mind and body. This isn't empathy. This is survival in the worst disguise possible. Think about that narcissistic friend who always leaves you feeling drained. You've probably told yourself it's because they talk too much about themselves, or because they don't give you the space to share your own feelings. But the truth is darker. They're not just taking your energy, They're projecting their own hidden neediness onto you. The very emptiness they refuse to face in themselves becomes the hollowness you carry after every interaction. You leave the conversation feeling small, unworthy, or used, when in reality, you were just the container for emotions that were never yours to begin with. Or consider your boss who somehow makes you feel incompetent, even when you've done nothing wrong. You question yourself, wondering if you've messed up, doubting your abilities, feeling the creeping anxiety of not being good enough. But that incompetence isn't yours. It's theirs. It's their own unspoken imposter syndrome, their own fear of not measuring up that has been silently transferred into your nervous system. And because you don't have the psychological armor most people wear, you absorb it as if it's the truth about you. Jung called this shadow projection for a reason. What's buried in the unconscious doesn't vanish. It seeks a host, and sensitive people, the ones without strong psychological boundaries, are perfect hosts. You've been walking through life like a house with all the windows and doors thrown wide open. Every unacknowledged emotion floating through the atmosphere walks right in and takes a seat at your table. You feed it, you water it, and eventually you mistake it for a permanent part of yourself. This is why you've spent so much of your life feeling broken, because you're living under the weight of a chronic psychological infection, and like any infection, it spreads. One person's unacknowledged shame becomes your gnawing guilt. Another person's suppressed rage becomes your sudden outburst. Their secret despair becomes your exhaustion. You're not crazy, you're contaminated. You've been soaking in the psychic waste of everyone around you, and it has warped your sense of who you are. But here's the most brutal twist. It's not random. The people around you unconsciously sense your openness, your willingness to carry what they cannot face, and they use it, not always with malice, not even always knowingly, but the result is the same. You've become their dumping ground. They unload because you'll absorb. They project because you'll carry, and you've been confusing their shadows for your identity. This trap is why so many sensitive people struggle with boundaries, because the moment you try to push back, you feel crushing guilt. You've been trained by family, by society, by your own unconscious habits that your role is to be the container, to say yes when you mean no, to forgive when you're still bleeding, to absorb when you're already drowning. And so the cycle continues. The world dumps, and you suffocate under the weight of shadows that were never yours. But Jung's insight flips the script. He realized that this unbearable tension is not sustainable. The psyche cannot live forever under the weight of borrowed emotions. Eventually, something breaks. And that breaking point, as terrifying as it feels, is not a collapse of weakness. It's a collapse of lies. The lie that you must carry everyone else's pain. The lie that your kindness requires your self-destruction. The lie that you're fragile because you feel so much. What breaks in you is not your essence. It's the false identity built on other people's shadows. When you finally see the trap, everything changes. You begin to recognize that the voice in your head telling you you're not enough might not even be yours. That shame pressing down on you might belong to someone else entirely. That exhaustion you carry might be the residue of someone else's chaos. The moment you realize this, you stop being the victim of projection and start becoming conscious of it. And that shift, awareness, is the first step toward freedom. But awareness alone isn't enough. Because once the shadows start piling up, once the infection spreads too far, the psyche takes drastic measures. It tears the house down. It demolishes the false structure so that something real can emerge. This is what you've been taught to fear as the breakdown. But Jung knew better. He called it the beginning of individuation, and that's where the story turns. Because what looks like destruction is actually the start of your transformation. There comes a moment when the weight becomes unbearable. You've carried everyone else's fears, guilt, and unspoken pain for so long that your own soul begins to suffocate. At first, it creeps in quietly. Trouble sleeping, constant exhaustion, that gnawing anxiety you can't explain. Then it intensifies. You find yourself staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m., wondering why you feel like a stranger in your own life. You can't focus. You can't breathe deeply. You can't remember the last time you felt light. And then it happens. The collapse. For most people, this is the part they fear the most. The day you can't get out of bed. The moment you look in the mirror and don't recognize the tired, hollow-eyed stranger staring back. The night you finally admit to yourself that being the endless giver, the tireless helper, the one who always says yes, is slowly destroying you. Society calls it a breakdown. Friends and family might whisper about burnout, stress, or emotional instability. But Jung saw something entirely different. He saw a breakthrough. He described it as a controlled demolition. Think of a skyscraper that was never built on the right foundation. It looks impressive on the outside, but every year the weight grows heavier, the cracks widen, and the structure groans under the pressure. At some point, the only way to save what truly matters is to tear it down, not out of cruelty, not out of failure, but because the foundation must be rebuilt, this time with truth instead of lies. That's what your psyche does when it pushes you into collapse. It's tearing down the false identity you built around self-sacrifice and endless people-pleasing. It's removing the mask you've worn for so long that you began to think it was your real face. This demolition feels terrifying because it destroys the version of you that the world applauded. The version that never asked for help. The version that carried other people's shadows without complaint. The version that believed goodness meant disappearing for the sake of others. But Jung knew this collapse wasn't the end of you. It was the end of your false self. The end of the persona you created to survive in a world that mistook sensitivity for weakness. And once that mask cracks, once the rubble clears, something extraordinary begins to emerge. Here's the paradox. The breakdown feels like death, but it's actually rebirth. You think you're losing everything, but what you're really losing are the chains that kept you imprisoned. That suffocating pressure. The one that told you to always smile, always forgive, always absorb, explodes, and in its place rises something raw and real. For the first time, you meet the parts of yourself you've buried. Your anger, your boundaries, your selfishness, your unfiltered truth. They rush out like fire, shocking you with their intensity. And though it feels like chaos, it's actually your psyche restoring balance. Jung called this the night sea journey. It's a plunge into darkness, into the unconscious, where the old self dissolves so that the true self can emerge. Every sensitive person who reaches their breaking point is forced onto this journey. It feels like drowning at first, like you're being consumed by everything you feared. But within that darkness is the alchemy that changes you. What was once unbearable pain becomes fuel. What once felt like weakness becomes strength, and the collapse that threatened to destroy you becomes the crucible that forges you into someone new. This is why your breakdown is not random. It's not a sign that you're fragile or defective. It's the psyche's last desperate attempt to save you from annihilation by forcing you to face the truth. The truth that you cannot endlessly give without receiving. The truth that you cannot absorb other people's shadows without setting boundaries. The truth that your anger and your needs are not flaws. They're survival instincts. And when the psyche finally demands that you acknowledge these truths, it does so with the force of an earthquake. You can't ignore it anymore. You can't numb it away. You have to rebuild. So the real question isn't whether you'll break down. Sensitive souls almost always do. The question is whether you'll recognize that breakdown for what it really is: a breakthrough, a controlled demolition, a necessary descent into chaos that clears the ground for something indestructible to rise. Jung saw it again and again. The most sensitive people, once they endured their night sea journey, came back stronger, wiser, and more unshakable than anyone else, because they had faced what others spend a lifetime avoiding. They had met their shadows and survived. This is the turning point. This is the place where the narrative shifts from suffering to transformation. Because now, in the ruins of who you thought you were, you're about to meet the parts of yourself that hold the key to your strength. And it begins with facing the figure you've been running from your entire life, your shadow. When the dust of your collapse finally settles, something terrifying happens. You come face to face with the parts of yourself you've been running from your entire life. The anger you buried because you thought good people don't get angry. The selfishness you suppressed because you were told putting yourself first was wrong. The voice inside that wanted to say no, but was silenced by guilt. These parts have been locked away in the basement of your psyche for years, maybe decades. And now, with the walls torn down, they're standing in front of you. This is the shadow. Carl Jung described the shadow as everything you reject, repress, or deny about yourself. It's not just the bad traits. It's also the natural instincts, the normal reactions, and the hidden strengths that didn't fit your self-image. Carl Jung described in story vor idibor with fordring with born a made shoe. If you've built your identity around being endlessly kind, then your anger lives in the shadow. If you've built your life around selflessness, then your needs live in the shadow. If you've spent your life trying to be agreeable, then your boundaries live in the shadow. Piece by piece, all the things you disowned were exiled into the dark corners of your mind, where they festered and waited. This is why meeting the shadow feels so unsettling. You're not just meeting your worst fears, you're meeting the full version of yourself, and it's overwhelming. The rage that suddenly surges when someone crosses your line, the bitterness that bubbles up when you realize how much you've been taken for granted, the selfish impulses that scream to be acknowledged. You've spent so long trying to be the perfect helper, the peacemaker, the one who never makes waves, that these feelings feel alien, even dangerous. But they're not evil. They're the missing pieces of your wholeness. Take anger, for example. All your life, you may have believed that anger makes you cruel, that if you allowed yourself to feel it, you'd become selfish or destructive. But Jung saw anger differently. He saw it as your boundary system trying to come online. That fire in your chest when someone disrespects you isn't moral failure. It's your psyche's way of saying, enough. Without anger, you stay defenseless, endlessly absorbing and sacrificing. With anger, you finally draw the line. It's not destruction, it's protection. Or look at selfishness. You've probably carried guilt every time you wanted to put yourself first, convinced it made you a bad person. But selfishness, when integrated, becomes sacred self-care. It's the recognition that your energy is precious, that you cannot endlessly pour from an empty cup. It's not about neglecting others, it's about finally valuing yourself. Without it, you're a sponge. With it, you're a vessel with the ability to choose when and how to give. Even cruelty. The capacity to say no, to cut ties, to refuse manipulation, lives in the shadow. You fear it because you don't want to hurt people. But integrated cruelty isn't about harming others, it's about refusing to let yourself be harmed. It's the steel edge of compassion, the clarity that allows you to see through manipulation before it drains you. Without it, you're blind. With it, you have psychological X-ray vision. This is why Jung described the shadow not just as darkness, but as a treasure chest buried in the basement of the psyche. Hidden within the traits you fear most are the qualities you need most. Your instinct to protect yourself, your strength to assert boundaries, your ability to prioritize your own needs without guilt. These aren't flaws, they're gold disguised as dirt. But you only uncover them when you're brave enough to face the shadow directly. And here's the paradox. When you integrate your shadow, you don't become a monster. You become dangerous. Dangerous to those who would exploit your kindness. Dangerous to those who rely on your silence. Dangerous to the systems that thrive on you giving everything and demanding nothing in return. Not dangerous in cruelty, but dangerous in wholeness. Because once you own your darkness consciously, no one can use it against you. Your anger no longer leaks out as anxiety. Your selfishness no longer disguises itself as burnout. Your shadow no longer sabotages you from the basement. Instead, it becomes a source of power you can wield with precision. Jung put it simply, whoever is possessed by their shadow is always standing in their own light and falling into their own traps. That's the trap you've been in, sabotaged by the very traits you repressed. But when you integrate, when you consciously accept and own those traits, you step into alignment. You stop falling into traps. You stop being a victim of unconscious energy. You become whole. So yes, meeting the shadow is terrifying. It shatters the image you've worked so hard to maintain. But in that shattering, something profound happens. You stop pretending. You stop performing. And you begin living as your authentic self. Sensitive, yes, but also strong, unapologetic, and unbreakable. This is the alchemy of transformation. The lead of repression turns into the gold of integration, and once you taste that power, you can never go back. Something changes the moment you stop rejecting your shadow and start owning it. The flood of emotions doesn't disappear. You still feel deeply, but the chaos that once ruled your life begins to reorganize itself into clarity. Where you once absorbed everything like a sponge, now you filter. Where you once carried other people's burdens unconsciously, now you decide what belongs to you and what doesn't. It's like your psyche installs a filtration system, separating your truth from everyone else's projections. The feelings are still there, but they no longer own you. Imagine walking into that same crowded restaurant that used to overwhelm you. Before, the tension between the couple at table 6 would have wrapped around your chest like a vice. The loneliness of the elderly man dining alone would have settled into your bones as if it were your own despair. The exhaustion radiating from the waitress would have drained your energy before you even finished your meal. But now, something is different. You still notice it all. You still see, still sense, still care. But instead of drowning in it, you observe it. You register it, but you don't absorb it. Their energy stays with them. Yours stays with you. For the first time in your life, you realize you can feel deeply without losing yourself. This is what Jung meant by balance. He called it the union of eros and logos, of feeling and thinking working in harmony. Before, your empathy was raw, an open circuit, endlessly transmitting and receiving, with no regulation. Now it's strategic. You choose when to engage, when to protect, when to walk away. Empathy stops being a curse and becomes intelligence. You see through dynamics others miss. You can sense manipulation before it hooks you. You can recognize projection before it buries you. It's like developing psychological X-ray vision, and once you see, you cannot unsee. Your boundaries, which once felt fragile or non-existent, now transform into something extraordinary. They're no longer walls of guilt or hesitation. They're living, intelligent membranes, flexible enough to let in what nourishes you, strong enough to repel what drains you. They don't just protect you, they empower you. Because now, when someone tries to dump their shadow onto you, it doesn't stick. Their shame bounces off. Their rage fails to penetrate. Their manipulation fizzles before it can spark. You're no longer the open house for other people's trash. You've become an electrified fortress, calm, steady, untouchable. And people notice the narcissistic friend who once left you feeling drained. Suddenly, they sense the shift. Their neediness no longer finds purchase in you. They can't dump their emptiness into your system because you've closed the doors. The manipulative boss, their subtle attempts to undermine you fall flat because you can see their insecurity for what it is, and you no longer confuse it with your identity. Friends who only call when they need something. You hear the unspoken transaction before you answer. And this time, you say no. Not with anger, not with cruelty, but with a quiet, unshakable certainty. And that no, spoken from wholeness, changes everything. This is the moment you realize the power of integration. The rage you once buried now fuels your boundaries. The selfishness you once feared now becomes sacred self-care. The cruelty you rejected now transforms into discernment. The ability to see through lies and manipulation without apology. These weren't flaws. They were strengths waiting to be claimed. And the sensitivity that once made you fragile now makes you formidable. Because unlike most people, you don't just react to emotions, you understand them. You don't just absorb energy, you shape it. You've become conscious of what was once unconscious, and that consciousness is your armor. It's not about becoming cold or detached. Quite the opposite. You can love more deeply now than ever before, because love is no longer a transaction that drains you. You can hold space for others without becoming their dumping ground. You can say yes when it matters, and no when it protects you, without guilt. Your empathy hasn't diminished. It's evolved. It's sharpened into a weapon of clarity, one that allows you to navigate a chaotic, emotionally contagious world without losing your center. This transformation is why sensitive people, once awakened, often become the most unshakable individuals you'll ever meet. They've lived through the collapse, endured the night sea journey, and faced their shadows head-on. They know what it's like to drown, and they've learned how to breathe underwater. That resilience makes them untouchable, because when you've faced the darkest parts of yourself and survived, nothing external can threaten you in the same way again. This is your turning point. The moment sensitivity ceases to be a wound and becomes a weapon. The moment you stop being defined by what others dump onto you and start defining yourself. The empath who once walked through life unshielded, absorbing every shadow, has evolved into something else entirely. You've become not just an empath, you've become a conscious empath. And that shift doesn't just change you. It changes everything around you. Once you've tasted the strength that comes from integrating your shadow, there's no going back. You no longer mistake fragility for kindness or guilt for compassion. Instead, you begin living from a center that feels unshakable. Jung called this process individuation, the journey of becoming whole, of aligning your conscious self with your deeper, authentic nature. And for the sensitive soul, this shift is nothing less than revolutionary. Before your ego was in charge, that part of you obsessed with being liked, keeping the peace, and avoiding conflict dictated everything. Your ego whispered, "Don't upset them. Don't say no. Don't be too much." And so you shrank, edited yourself, and carried shadows that were never yours. But now, after walking through collapse, after meeting your shadow, you realize something profound. Your ego is not the truth of who you are. It was just the mask you wore to survive. With individuation, the mask falls. You no longer bend over backwards for approval, because approval no longer defines you. You no longer panic at the thought of rejection, because rejection no longer threatens your identity. You've discovered that your value doesn't come from how much you give or how little space you take up. It comes from something deeper, from being aligned with your true self, yourself with a capital S, the part of you that is rooted, whole, and unshakable. And this changes everything. Guilt trips that once crushed you now bounce off like rubber bullets. The manipulations that once kept you silent now look almost laughably transparent. External validation, the compliments, the attention, the applause that used to fuel you, no longer has power over you because you've learned to validate yourself. You no longer need the world to tell you you're enough. You know it in your bones. This doesn't mean you become arrogant or detached. In fact, you become more grounded, more real. You can say no without apology, and yes without resentment. You can walk away from toxic people without second-guessing whether you're being too harsh. You can stand in your truth even when others disagree, because your compass is no longer external. It's internal. That's individuation, living not from the borrowed projections of others, but from the clarity of your own integrated self. And people around you notice. The ones who once exploited your kindness feel the shift first. They realize the old tricks, guilt, shame, manipulation don't work anymore. They may pull away, confused, even angry, because their shadow can no longer find a home inside you. Others, though, the ones who respect authenticity, are drawn closer. They sense the solidity in you, the balance between sensitivity and strength. You become magnetic, not because you're people-pleasing, but because you embody something rare, authenticity. This is why Jung said individuation was the highest calling of the psyche. Most people never reach it. They live and die trapped in their masks, forever acting out roles assigned by family, culture, and fear. But for those who walk through collapse and emerge on the other side, individuation is liberation. It's the freedom to be whole, unapologetic, and aligned with truth. And here's the paradox. You don't stop being sensitive. You still feel deeply. You still notice the unspoken tensions in the room, the emotions others pretend don't exist. But now, you aren't consumed by them. Your sensitivity becomes conscious. Instead of drowning in other people's energy, you navigate it like a skilled sailor steering through storms. You can sense the waves without being pulled under. That's the difference between an unconscious empath and a conscious one. One drowns, the other learns to walk on water. This transformation isn't just personal, it ripples outward. Every boundary you set teaches others where healthy connection begins. Every time you refuse to carry someone else's shame, you show them what it looks like to take responsibility for their own. Every time you embody strength without losing compassion, you model a new way of being. Individuation doesn't just liberate you, it inspires others to seek their own wholeness. And yet, individuation is not a finish line. It's a way of living. It means constantly balancing your sensitivity with your boundaries, your compassion with your truth. It means staying awake to the traps of projection and manipulation, and refusing to fall back into old patterns of people-pleasing. It means walking through the world conscious, aware, and grounded, even when chaos surrounds you. This is the culmination of the journey, moving from ego-driven survival to self-centered authenticity, from unconscious absorption to conscious mastery, from fragility to unshakable wholeness. Jung called it individuation. You can call it finally coming home to yourself. And this raises the ultimate question. Now that you've seen who you really are, what will you do with it? Because individuation isn't just about personal peace. It's about answering the call to use your gift, your evolved sensitivity, in a world that desperately needs it. Look around you. We're living in an age of emotional chaos. Social media amplifies every outrage, every insecurity, every unspoken shadow. Politics has turned empathy into a weapon. Families fracture under the weight of unacknowledged wounds. People are more disconnected from their authentic selves than ever before. And in the middle of it all are the sensitive ones, the empaths, the feelers, the absorbers, trying to survive a world that doesn't understand them. But here's the truth. The world doesn't just need you to survive. It needs you to awaken. You see, unconscious empaths are everywhere. They feel everything, but they don't know how to process it. They drown in the projections of others, mistaking shadows for their own identity. They burn out, collapse, and suffer silently, never realizing that their breakdown is the doorway to transformation. But conscious empaths, the ones who've walked through the fire, faced their shadows, and claimed their wholeness, those are rare. And right now, they are the ones the world needs most. Because conscious empaths don't just feel pain, they transform it. They don't just absorb shadows, they recognize them for what they are and refuse to carry them. They don't just offer compassion, they offer clarity. They show others what healthy boundaries look like. They break cycles of projection simply by refusing to play the old roles. Every time a conscious empath says, "That shame isn't mine," "That anger isn't mine," "That manipulation doesn't belong in me," the chain is broken, and those breaks ripple outward, healing more than just one person. They shift entire dynamics. Think about what this means. A "no, you speak with strength" is not just for you. It teaches others that no is sacred. Every boundary you hold firm isn't just self-protection. It's a blueprint for healthy connection. Every time you refuse to be someone's dumping ground, you're modeling what it looks like to live consciously, awake, and whole. This is not selfishness. This is leadership, and the world is starving for it. Your journey wasn't random. The breakdown you endured, the shadows you carried, the collapse that nearly destroyed you, none of it was meaningless. It was an initiation. Jung saw individuation as the ultimate calling of the psyche, but you can see it for what it truly is: a summons. You've been called not just to heal yourself, but to embody what evolved empathy looks like in a broken world. You've been called to be the one who can feel deeply without drowning, who can love without losing themselves, who can stand in compassion without being manipulated. And make no mistake, this path isn't easy. It demands vigilance. It demands you keep choosing authenticity over approval, boundaries over guilt, and wholeness over performance. It demands that you refuse to slip back into the unconscious patterns of self-sacrifice that once defined you. But every time you make that choice, you strengthen the foundation. Every time you embody conscious empathy, you become a lighthouse for those still lost in the storm. So the question is no longer, "Am I too sensitive?" You already know the answer. Sensitivity was never the problem. Unconsciousness was. The real question is, what will you do with it now? Will you remain the sponge, forever absorbing what doesn't belong to you? Or will you rise as the conscious empath, the one who sees, who feels, who filters, and who chooses? This is your call to action. To stop apologizing for the way you were built and start mastering it. To stop confusing fragility with sensitivity and start embodying strength. To stop hiding from your shadow and start wielding it as the weapon it was always meant to be. The world doesn't need fewer empaths. It needs conscious ones. It needs you. So, I'll leave you with this. Your breakdown wasn't your ending. It was your beginning. Your shadow isn't your enemy. It's your power. Your sensitivity isn't your curse. It's your calling. The only question left is this: will you answer the call?